Alright, we're going to be modeling a dragon today. I'm going to be using Maya. You can pretty much use anything you want. What I'm doing first is I'm putting my reference images on planes, and then I'm going to put those planes and make sure they're the right proportional scale and pretty much put them vertically on new layers. And then I'm going to use backface culling to get rid of that black panel on the back of the plane so that I can see through the mesh, and then I'm going to put it on a new layer and lock it. So once that's done, you have to realize that no matter what you do, this is right now about 3 hours worth of work. I had 3 hours of video, and so this is 3 hours worth of work. Also realize that I lost the file because I didn't save it, so I lost about an hour's worth of work as well. I'm starting out simply duplicating this object, a simple box 2x2x2, and I'm rounding it out, and then I'm fitting it to the body. The key point in doing this, you'll notice that I'm just adding edge loops in here to round out the form. I'm extruding then that form to fit the rest of the body. Now, the pose might not be the best for this particular dragon. I potentially probably wanted to keep it a little bit more straighter, but I felt like this was more like a dog greyhound style, so that's why I kind of kept it the way it was. And you'll notice I just extrude the tail out, and then I spend the majority of my time simply going through and forming things out. The biggest issue that I see with students modeling is that they model from one direction, model from another direction, and then they feel like they're done. You'll notice that I'm just going back and forth and rounding things out, adjusting my form, and again I'm using one plane, but then you'll notice I go back in and kind of reshape things. I'm not really using the side plane a whole lot, but that's something that's because I've modeled a long time. Now, you'll notice that I keep adding edge loops, and I keep forming out the shape to make sure things look good. And I'm trying to get a little bit more geometry in there, but I'm not going crazy with it. You'll notice that I don't add a ton of geometry. I'm spending more time working on form. Now for the legs, I grab 2 polygons and extrude them out, and then I shape them into a cylinder using circular cylindrical forming. And then same thing with the other leg, I'm just moving and rotating and basically forming out that base item. Now when it comes to the toes, you'll notice that I do 1 polygon for each toe, so it's basically a box that I'm extruding outward. Now if I have more geometry, this would make more sense. And I'm doing the same thing with the wing. I'm just extruding things out and kind of moving things around. You'll notice that I'm not worried about the interior of the wing right now. I can do that 2 different ways. I can either use a plane or I can use a piece of geometry. In this case, I'm going to use geometry. But I spend more time moving back and forth around the model to get a good form. And then when I need more geometry or when I need more detail, that's when I add more geometry. That's when I add another edge loop and form things out. So at this point, I would consider the model kind of blocked out. It's not perfect, but it is ultimately a good shape and form. And you'll notice I spend a lot of time tweaking these little areas. I'm also jumping back and forth between the subdivision mode and the low poly mode and kind of checking form, because I don't want to rely on subdivision, but I still want to see what it's going to look like when I do add in more geometry. Now with this, you'll notice that what I'm doing is I'm going through and I'm adding in more geometry between the toes. So I'm adding in a little bit of geometry, and what I've done was basically chamfer. Now, chamfer wasn't the best idea, but it worked for what I'm doing. And I'm ultimately spending time to redirect the geometry that's between the toes, that's around the toe loop, so that ultimately it's going to be easier to animate if I put bones in there and kind of move things around. The big thing about doing any type of organic modeling like animals or people or things like that is ultimately having clean geometry. You'll notice I spend a lot of time just getting the foot right. And all I'm doing with it is I'm making sure, one, that I've got good edge looping on there, and two, I have quad geometry. You'll notice here that as I kind of get that all set nice, I am ultimately going through then and just kind of forming them out a little bit, and now I'm adding the claws to the front. And so you'll notice that a lot of what I'm doing is simply just kind of moving things around. Now, once that's done, you'll notice again I'm shaping, forming, kind of creating some edge loops, checking for end-gons, and things like that. That's a key point in how you model. You want to always have consistently good geometry, because as you get, I've always found that if you have a lot of end-gons or things are like kind of hectic and chaotic, it's a lot harder to work than it is to kind of move on to the next step, because you're always fixing the stuff that you left behind. And so you'll notice that ultimately going back to the other set of toes, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm separating them a little bit so that they have polygons in the middle. And this is that next level. Once you block out the basic form, this is when you start adding in edge loops and start creating things like this. So I spend a lot of time creating these edge loops and looping things around, and that's the big part of modeling. Now, if I were sculpting this, I wouldn't have to worry so much about the edge loops, but I would have to worry about it in retopology. Most of the schools that I teach for, they still teach mudbox in a lot of them, and it's because it's cheap and it's free with the Autodesk licensing. It still gives you the sculpting ability, but you have to have a base to work with. And ultimately, what's going on is I'm going through and I'm just kind of cleaning up each of these little pieces. I'm making sure that, you know, the form is there, and then I'll add in more edge loops. And here what I'm doing is I'm creating a mouth loop in there. So I'm extruding the mouth inward so that it has a little bit more kind of definition in there. So then what I'm going to do once that's done is go through and extrude the inner mouth so that it works, so that I have space basically for a tongue or for whatever else I want in there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an eye using a simple sphere, and I'm going to add that eye in and create a extrusion around it and turn it into a cylinder. And so then I'm creating my eyelid. So you'll notice that right now I'm just used circumference tool in there and just kind of made it round. And then I'm basically creating eyelids, and I'm building an eyebrow around it, and I'm just kind of looking at it from different angles. I decided the eye needed to move up, so I'm moving it up and kind of adjusting everything. Once that's done, I extrude it inward a little bit so that it gets me a kind of an interior loop. You'll notice now what I'm doing is I'm going through and I'm chamfering the edges so that I get this little diamond, if you will, in there. And then what I'm going to do with that is ultimately go through and create a edge loop. And you'll notice as I keep doing this, I'm still moving things and adjusting things back and forward. I need to get my shape and form down so that I basically have a good concept. Then what I'm going to do is I'm extruding these spikes here, and I'm readjusting the horns and basically bringing that. I'm going to do the same thing I'm going to do with the wings. So you'll see here as I do this, I'm forming everything out, I'm making sure it looks good, and I'm deleting the interiors when you extrude. Always leaves a little plane on the inside, so I got to delete those. And I'm extruding these outward and kind of matching it on the side view as I do it. But I'm also paying attention to the front and the sides and everything as I keep going forward. Now I've got an edge loop in there where I've got extra geometry, and what I'm doing is I'm basically using bridge to bridge these together. Now I wasn't thinking when I did it, so I have some interior loops, and you'll notice that when I subdivide it or turn on 3 for subdivision. So ultimately you have to go through and clean that up. Sometimes it's easier if you just give it a little thought to plan things out before you kind of jump into them and do them. And you'll notice here when I try and do an edge loop, it doesn't quite do an edge loop. So I have to go in, delete the edges or the faces on the inside, and reconnect everything. And then here I just basically connect everything together and kind of move back and forth. And sometimes I even have to delete a face to redo it again because it flipped it somehow. So you'll see my holes, I just have to go clean those up. So once the wings are done, and you'll notice the wings are done in a horizontal, or they're done in a vertical flat mode. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's a lot easier to manipulate the geometry when it's going in the XY axis than when you've got something kind of off. So you'll notice here that after I clean this up, I'm going and doing the same thing for the head spines too. So you'll notice I'm jumping back and forth, and I'm looking at my geometry and seeing that it's clean. And what I'm doing is I'm just adding another edge loop in here, and because they're so small and I'm working with some triangles in there, I have to do it manually in a lot of areas. And then from there I'm going to basically go back and forth and bridge these back and forth together again. But you'll notice that a lot of this is doing one thing, making sure the geometry is good, and moving to the next step. If you don't have good geometry at the basic level, then what's going to happen is the more complex your model gets, the worse it'll get because you have a ton of geometry. Now, as I do this, I'm really not using a whole lot of tools. I'm using the extrude, I'm using bridge, I'm using claps, and I'm using cut. And once in a while I use chamfer. But those are the top tools that I'm using. I just have to cut in some geometry or readjust the edge loops as I build it. And so you see here, I'm working on the eye, and I'm getting that eye so that it has a good edge loop. And I'm also double checking n-gons, making sure that I don't have a ton of n-gons floating around, and looking around the model as a whole to see what looks good and what doesn't. Now I'm going to work on those spines, and you can see that I'm basically extruding them and shaping them down. They left a weird little hole in there, so again, because I did the extrude face, if I do extrude edge, it'll do it even cleaner. So I have to go through and clean those all up, and basically moving around that geometry. And I'm also extruding a little geometry on the edge to give it a little thickness, and so that way it gives me kind of exactly what I'm looking for. So you can see I'm going through, deleting the edges, and then bridging things together. This is a rinse and repeat action. It's just a matter of getting clean geometry every time I do it, and that's all that I need to do. So at this point, the model isn't ready for animation. I would have to add in more geometry in the elbows and the other joints and things like that in order to get better bending during animation. It's also not ready for sculpting either because I have a lot of rectangles going on. So what I will need to do is go through and kind of get rid of some of those hard triangles, or rectangles. The more rectangles you have, when you subdivide, it makes more rectangles, and it leaves a weird sculpt when you try and sculpt it in like ZBrush. I'm sorry, Mudbox. So, and that's most of what colleges use because they don't want to pay for the licensing for ZBrush. And so you can see here, I'm basically still going through and adjusting overall shapes. I'm adding in edge loops and adding in a little bit more geometry so that I can move the hips a little bit easier without having that extra geometry fail. And then I'm grabbing the entire edge loop down the middle and I'm pushing it together. I've collapsed these together, and then once that's collapsed together, I'm going in and turning the merge vertices, but I'm lowering the power of it so that ultimately I can grab a lot of the geometry, just hit the button once, and it won't collapse geometry that I don't want to happen. So you can see here that I'm just kind of going through and cleaning these edges up here. And again, I still round out faces, forms, and things like that. So a lot of this is just basically going through, merging those edges, making sure it's collapsed together. And then once that's done, I'm done with the model. And you have to realize modeling isn't easy. It takes practice and it's hard. It's an art form. You have to understand geometry, you have to understand anatomy. On a creature model like this, you have to understand basically everything that kind of goes around. So you'll see here that I'm just ultimately going through and kind of working on that. And I recommend save often because, as I said before, I lost 2 hours of modeling because I didn't save often. And I turn off my save increment tool because it slows down my modeling process, especially when I'm in the middle of modeling. But ultimately, it's a matter of just going through, cleaning up your geometry, and fixing it accordingly. If you have any questions on this, feel free to ask. I can post slower or individual parts if you're looking at it. Let me know, and I hope this helps.